Thanks guys for having me. My talk is called Solidus UI, an exploration into UI toolkits. So I've been doing Solidus for several years, I guess, but I haven't done it recently. I am no longer in e-commerce, I guess, but I kind of jumped at the opportunity to give a talk at this. So I was super excited. So a little bit about me. I lead front-end development at a company called Sendoso. And I've worked the last several years working on design systems, shareable UIs, and just figuring out how to make the web better for both users and developers. So really important for me to make developer experiences as good as possible. So like I said, I work at a company called Sendoso. And if you Google this right now, you would this is what our website would say, right? And it's just kind of fancy marketing terms for saying corporate gift giving. So basically a way for companies to make connections with others. And so I think that's especially important now with our current times, like we're doing virtual conferences right now. And so how do you make personal connections even though you are not necessarily face-to-face? And so that's kind of what we do. There's some really exciting things going on. We just recently announced 100 million Series C. We have offices in San Francisco, Scottsdale, Lahore, and Dublin. We're remote friendly and we're hiring. We're hiring for all positions. So even if you're not necessarily looking for a job, but you're just remotely interested in a job, feel free to reach out to me. I had a little trouble. I have a lot of animated GIFs in my talk today, and I'm not 100% sure if there's going to be some technical difficulties or if they're not going to load properly. But I guess that's part of the good part of these virtual conferences, right? There's a low barrier of entry, so even if things don't work out, that's okay, because we didn't have to drive 2,000 miles to get here, right? And yes, I did say GIF and not GIF. Don't at me on that one. I do kind of like this one though with Jeff. I think we should all start saying that. Or, we don't really have this problem with the other ones, right? Like JPEGs, we just say JPEG or PNG or something, right? So why don't we say GIFs? I think we should start going on that one. So I will say I spent a lot of time, my slides are in Google Slides. And turns out they don't have a lot of good transitions and cool animations and stuff. They're very vanilla. And so I always loved the star wipe from this episode of The Simpsons. And so it's always been my lifelong dream to do a presentation just full of star wipes, because that's what Homer told us is the best one. So you're gonna have to bear with me. This is gonna be my makeshift star wipe, so that you guys can help me fulfill my lifelong goal of doing a presentation with star wipes. So let's get into it though. This is kind of a throwback to my last conference talk, which was from 2019, where it was basically an overview of the state of the Solidus API. And if you haven't watched it, I would go recommend it. It's kind of a follow-up for this. And I think I alluded to this talk as well. So this is something that's sort of been in the back of my mind for several years. But anyway, in this talk, we talked about just the state of the REST API, the Solidus SDK that we built and how we used it, how it can be used, and how it can be used to build modern front ends, as well as native apps. So I think it's really cool, and it's sort of a precursor for this one. So before we begin, what even is a toolkit? I think that's a word that there's a lot of words that sound very similar to toolkit, right? Like you might hear toolkit, component library, design system, etc. Right? There's a lot of terms for this, and they're all sound and are more or less the same, right? But if we Google this in the dictionary, a toolkit in computing is a set of software tools. So it's really just a set of tools that we can make that will make our lives easier, and have more tools for completing certain tasks, right? Here's our first star wipe. So how is this really relevant to Solidus though? I think it's the things that we're going to talk about today are both applicable to Solidus itself, but I think the principles are pretty universal. And so the things that we talk about here may be applied to your company's component library or some other design system that you're working on. It's all very applicable and universal, but specifically for Solidus, I think a good thing to do is to occasionally stop and look at what other platforms are doing. So I don't know if you've looked it up, but like recently Shopify announced their Hydrogen, right, which is a React-based framework for building custom storefronts using Shopify. And it's pretty cool. It has a lot of cool hooks and components and tools that you can use to build a front end on Shopify. And clearly they put a lot of work into it. And I think this shows that there's clearly some demand for this. So for Solidus to be able to continue to thrive and be competitive, I think it's something that needs to be considered is how does Solidus provide something, maybe not the exact same thing, right? But how do we provide something to be able to stay competitive and draw new developers to come in to work in Solidus? So I guess the first question then is what would a Solidus UI toolkit even look like? And I think that's a good question. And actually, like once you start looking into it, I start to feel like this. This is how I usually feel when I think about these things. There's so many questions that we can have in order to figure out how we would do this, right? So some of the questions that I thought of initially are like, what technologies would we even use? How opinionated should it be? And what are the desired outcomes? And how do we make something that would work for everyone? And honestly, for all of these questions, and there's many more questions that we're not even going to cover today, but there are no right or wrong answers. And that's part of the hard part of this is that there's no one set way to build a really good toolkit or one set way to build a really good design system. There's just different outcomes depending on what decisions you choose. There's pros and there's cons. And every project that I've done this on ends up being different, but different because of different reasons, right? So let's just get started. Like, what is the goal? Why would we even want to do this? So some of the things that I can think of were improved developer experience. I think having a really good developer experience and being able to make it so that it's easy for engineers to come in, learn the platform and be productive and build really good UIs. Is very valuable because then I think that's a really good selling point that you don't necessarily would have to be able to invest so much into front-end architecture because there's already something there. And another benefit of this is improved user experience. If we can basically the idea is that if you combine all of your resources and are developing things together, everybody can sort of pitch in and come up with a better user experience. So rather than, and this is to the next point, right? Of stop reinventing the wheel. From what I remember, everybody was basically redoing all of their front ends, like in React, I think was the big one, right? And that's what I was doing when I was doing Solidus was sort of building a UI in React. And if you think about it, if there are 50 companies that are all doing the exact same thing, we're all building more or less the exact same experience. So why should we all do that 50 times when we could have a small group of people doing it once and do a really good job of it and then just sort of sharing the work? And so by doing that, if everybody sort of takes one piece and does a really, really good job at it, then we can all benefit and have a really good experience for our users for a fraction of their resources and time. So I don't know, that sounds pretty good to me. So I think one thing that's really good to look at is atomic design. So this picture comes from the atomic design. If you haven't taken a look and you don't know what atomic design is, I highly recommend it. It's not really just for designers. I think that's something that it's easy to say, oh, design, like the second you throw in the word design, it's like, good, that's just for designers. That's how they manage their designs, and then they give us something and it doesn't really transfer over. But I think it's something that not only applies to just building components themselves and UIs, but just the whole architecture of how you think about organizing software. So I think you can apply these principles to backend code as well. But anyway, basically the TLDR of atomic design, right, is that you have these really small components, right? Or the small pieces, atoms, right? And then you slowly get bigger and bigger. You're combining the atoms to make something a little bit more interesting, right? So like an atom itself might be text. And then a molecule might be like the button, right? And then an organism is something larger and larger until you get to the actual page. So if we apply this to the idea of toolkits, you can think of the atoms and molecules sort of as like your design system, right? And this is something that like every company, either good or bad, strict or very loosely defined, every project has a design system of some sort, right? And so that's sort of every company is unique and every project is unique in this way that they have its own design system. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have applications, right? And this is where like our templates and pages, and this is the apps that we're actually building day to day would fit in this pattern, right? And so that's our day to day. And so if we were to do a Solidus UI toolkit, right? I think it fits nicely right here in the middle. It's something that that is built, can be built upon atoms and molecules, but it is something that is meant to elevate the application development process, right? So if we are, if you have a really good set of these organisms that I can plug in my design system into, then theoretically, then it makes it so that it's easy for me to make the page building process easier because I already have all of these molecules ready to go for me. So another star wipe. This is all I got. That's the best I could do. I'm sorry. So let's talk about which technologies we would use, right? So these are all hypothetical things, right? Remember, no right or wrong answers. Like we got TypeScript, JavaScript, right? How do we style things? The API, right? Like, so you've got the REST API and there's a GraphQL API. So it's really hard for us to sort of answer these things, but I think the first thing that we would have to do is just take a little step back and ask ourselves first, how opinionated would we want this to be? And I think this is one of the harder ones because it sort of makes or breaks the system, right? I think something like maybe the hydrogen, right, it sounds a little bit more opinionated, like they call it a framework, right? And not just like a set of tools that they're building. So that's something a little bit more on the opinionated way of saying, basically, if it's more opinionated, it's harder to it may be harder to fit in your own tools into it, right? Or you're sort of stuck with a certain technology. Whereas on the other end, if it's unopinionated, it might be loosely defined and can fit with lots of things, but might require a little bit more overhead in order to hook it up into things, right? So let's take let's take a look at a couple of examples of things. So the first one is JavaScript, right? We're going to look at a couple of JavaScript technologies and ideas of how we could do this, right? So on a scale of unopinionated to opinionated, vanilla JavaScript, right? I think that's a pretty basic one. You can't get much more unopinionated than that. Basically, because you could fit it into any other framework or technology you wanted to use. The next one would be TypeScript. It's more or less the same. Honestly, I think TypeScript is sort of an outlier on this one because on any of these, we can use TypeScript. And I think there's a lot of value in using TypeScript now for libraries because even if your end users of a UI toolkit don't actually use TypeScript, they inherently gain benefit from it because of things like IntelliSense. So like their IDEs can read those types and show them documentation and stuff inline, right? So there's a lot of value in doing these things in TypeScript. The next level up is like a framework, right? So like React, Vue, Angular, Hotwire, right? So this is a little bit more opinionated because you're sort of sticking to one team versus another, right? And this does end up alienating some companies because like I think most companies are like you're either in a React camp or you're Vue or whatever, right? So going with one or the other, like it has its benefits. And then we can go one level up, right? And these are like the meta frameworks that are built on top of these other frameworks, right? So things like Next.js, Nuxt, and Remix, like there's a whole bunch of these, right? And this is sort of like going into the more opinionated way of saying like, what if we went to one of these meta frameworks and built a meta framework, right? for Solidus on top of one of these other ones, you sort of force all of the companies to go down and use like Nuxt, for instance, right? And you say, everybody, like, if you want to build a really good Solidus UI, you have to use Nuxt, but here's all the really cool stuff that we get. So you can sort of leverage the platform a little bit more if you do that. The next one, so I think that's enough JavaScript stuff. So the next thing is styling, right? So on a scale of unopinionated to opinionated, the first one is just bring your own styles, right? So it's like if you have a big component library and you don't want to be opinionated at all, you just say you bring your own styles. Like, we're not going to say anything at all. The next, I think this is a good option too, is just like, hey, like, you don't necessarily have to use our styles, but if you'd like, here's a set of default styles that will allow you to quickly get ramped up and sort of see how things work. So I think that's a pretty good option. The next one is to allow these components that we build right in our toolkit to own the styles themselves and sort of just expose certain changes using CSS variables. I think this is a really good one if you want to be more opinionated on how things are styled and have a little bit more control, but still allow a few overrides. And the next one is just built-in styles and make it really hard for components to be overridden. I wouldn't say this is probably something you'd want, because every store, especially in e-commerce, right? Like, stores are just so different. That's probably not a good one, but it has its place in other applications, right? And for a slide with CSS, I thought it was pretty lame and boring, so I decided to throw in this just to add a little pizzazz. Another star wipe. There we go. Okay, so this, I think now we've done enough hypothetical looking at things, right? So I wanted to throw together an example of, like, actually, how would this even work in Solidus? Like, it's not, so I like, just not me being hypothetical, like, I actually wanted to see an application of this. So what I did is I got the default Solidus together, right? I added Vue to it because I don't do React much anymore. So I put in Vue and I threw together an example of what one of these packages or what one of these molecules would look like, right? So this is an example. I replaced the cart link with just this sidebar cart experience, right? So that anytime on any page, the user would be able to see a preview of their cart without actually having to navigate to a new page. This is backed by the Solidus SDK package. So I thought that was pretty cool. It was nice to go back and use it. So anyway, this is basically what we're going to do is we're going to take some of those opinionated things that we just talked about, and we're actually just going to we're going to look at some code and sort of see like what some of the pros and cons might actually be. So first we're going to do, because I don't know how much Vue stuff, I know a lot of people have experience with React. So we're going to do some quick Vue 101 because all of my demos are in Vue. So a Vue component, this is an example of what's called a single file component. Basically, a component consists of a template tag, a script tag, and a style tag. And those are like the three things that a component may contain. So right here in this example, this is what the template tag looks like, right? And so you can see the markup, it's pretty similar. So we've got like a trigger button that would open up our, that actually opens up the drawer. And then we've got the drawer itself with its like dynamically hidden and shown, right? And then we've got a header with like the close button and the title, all of the line items we're rendering here, and then the footer with like the extra information, right? Pretty basic. Whoops. Okay, so this is the script section of this component that we made, right? And so this is where all of the logic goes. So we're storing state of if the drawer is actually open or not, as well as this is where we're fetching the order from using the Solidus SDK. Whoops. Spoilers. Okay, there we go. And so this is actually like, now we have this package, right? So I called it the Solidus UI Vue Cart package, right? And so all this package does is provide a really good cart experience and all of the different components that might be needed to build a cart experience in Vue. So this is my application, and this is just how I use it, right? Very basic. And so this is kind of what it would look like. This is the no styles, the bring your own styles version, right? And so you can see that it's like using some of the default styles, but very basic, not very usable initially. So we can go up to a level like this, right? And this is where we can either be very opinionated and include the styles. I kind of like this version. I don't know if some other companies, it might not fit with your design system. So you can do this way of just including all of the styles, right? Or exposing them with CSS variables, or doing the optional style sheet thing, right? Let's see. And you know, if that one was a little bit too cool, you can always do a little bit more basic version like this, right? But either way, like if usually when you end up adding default styles like this, it inevitably clashes with the application's existing design system or CSS. And you, a lot of times you run into problems. So I think inevitably everybody has to be able to style things to their own needs. So this is kind of what the markup in view looks like, of saying, hey, like I have my application what it was before, and here's what it looks like if I'm just including the default styles. And so that's just something like every package might be able to include its own CSS. And this is sort of what it would look like when just by exposing CSS variables of saying, hey, you can use this component, and we've managed some of the styles for you, but here's all of these variables that you can include yourself in order to override it. And this can get messy, like depending on how customizable things have to be. You could have 40 or 50 of these variables, which could be unwieldy, right? And so this sort of brings up another point of these, is like, we've talked about styling concerns, right? And making it so that it's easy for every team to be able to style things. But what about changing other stuff, right? Like in this example, like it had a title and a button, and we were displaying certain information about a line item. But what if a company needs to modify that? What if they want to make it so that the checkout, or like there's a checkout button at the bottom and that's not included? Or what if they want to change what the line items actually look like, or add an extra feature like being able to remove a line item from the cart? And that might not necessarily be included in this package. So how do you do that? You just have a whole bunch of props. Like this is an example of just like including like tons of props on this component, of saying, hey, you can change the title. And now, you know what, you want to be able to modify the trigger button. Here's another prop that allows you to modify the trigger button. And you could go down the line and think of 40 or 50 props, right, that could modify the DOM of that component, which can, when you have 40 or 50 props, like that can be pretty unwieldy and have a pretty bad developer experience, because you have to go learn and remember those 40 or 50 props, that those are even things, right? So we can do a thing, it's basically composition is what it's called, right? Where we can, in view, we call these slots, where we could take our component, right? And we had the trigger button, we had a header, and we had line items, and we had a footer, right? And so instead of just like being very opinionated in how we build these components, we can expose these slots and provide a little bit of tools for any implementer to be able to come in and add whatever they want for the trigger button, and add their own line items and figure out what their own content inside the drawer is. And same thing with the footer, right? So in React, I think we used the render props, right? And I think there's a few other patterns that you can use, but every language sort of has this idea of bring your own components. And so with this one, we have the exact same component, and it's using sort of all of the logic, and the smart and the hard parts are managed by the cart drawer component itself. But the actual UI, the very basics of like the title and the line items and stuff, is all custom to my application itself. So we can do some pretty cool things using the exact same component. You can very quickly throw together an example like this that might feel a little bit more like your site, and it adds a few more functionality things, right? Like we could add that checkout button at the bottom if we wanted. We could change quantity, like we could add that extra capabilities very easily. or using the exact same component, using my own components from my atoms and my molecules, right, from my design system. I could do something like this, right, which is looks completely different, but it's built using the exact same component, all thanks to the composability of it. So another thing that we have to think about is being able to hook into the actual life cycle. I think is another way to make things a little bit more composable, right? Is basically being able to expose certain events that happen within these components. So like in a cart drawer, right? Like we know that you can open it, we know that you can close it. We know that like maybe that once you add more functionality, like if you want to add that you can go to the checkout, right? Those are all events and things that can happen. Or there's errors, right? Like if something goes wrong and you can't fetch the data, like those are all events that happen within the component. But you can use event handlers and sort of expose these events to whoever the implementer is, so that they can add their own interesting functionality to it without actually having to change the component itself. So things like logging or like showing alert messages and toasts and stuff, right? Like those are all valuable use cases of being able to, or wanting to be able to hook into these certain events. And yeah, it's I think this is something that's super important in order to have these components be actually usable by other companies, because you never really know what all of the use cases are, but by exposing lifecycle events, it allows everybody to be super flexible. So back to the question of, as my previous talk talks about, like, you know, the REST API is pretty sweet. So would these components or this UI toolkit, would it rely on the REST API or GraphQL? And I think the nice thing is, still from the last talk, you can have both, right? The beauty of this is every package or every part of the toolkit can encapsulate how, like, the logic. So the implementer doesn't actually necessarily have to know that you're relying on the GraphQL API versus the REST API. It just all happens under the hood. So I think that's a really good way of basically like being able to support both. And if one company that's building one part of the toolkit is really into the REST API, then you can continue to use the REST API, even though, and I can use these components. And even though my company only uses the GraphQL API, under the hood of this component, it's using the REST API, and I don't actually have to care, because the rest of my application is still using the GraphQL API. So another question that we have is, how would we even organize it, right? So in my example, I had a view cart package, which is specific to just view and the cart. And so theoretically, you could have lots of these packages, right? Like a view variant picker and a view product images. I don't know, right? There's lots of things that you could think of. So really, how do you manage it, right? We could do it similar, where it's like you could have a monorepo that contains all of these packages. You could have one really big package that just exports a whole bunch of these components. So it'd just be like Solidus UI, and it just includes everything. Or you could do it in separate repositories. There's just a lot of things to think about. So some of the things that I run into, right? So there's pros and cons to both. So having a single package is really nice, just because it's easier to deploy. Like, you only have to focus on this one package. It's easy to keep things in sync, right? Because like, if you have this view cart package and it's dependent on another component, like, it's easy to just keep them in sync because they're all in the same package. So that's really nice as a community, that you don't have to like try to keep 50 different packages up to date and in sync. But this also causes some issues of like upgrade process you become a little bit more hesitant to change the API, because if you keep rapidly changing the API of this view cart, all of your other components sort of suffer, because even though like you might have a very basic variant picker that is very stable and you never want to change it, every time you make a change to one of those unrelated components, you have to release a major upgrade, and there's like a migration process with that, right? So if one company really wants to stick on one version of one of these components, but they want to upgrade to the latest of another one, it can cause some issues. And also, if you're not careful with like tree shaking and stuff, like it could become a really large package that you're forcing people to use, even though they only want one component. The next one is doing multiple packages. So my example showed multiple packages. The nice thing about this is you can be more opinionated and make the API of some of these change more rapidly as needed. Separation of concerns, and you sort of let everybody can develop them on their own processes. But there's a lot of overhead with actually deploying these and managing these. And then if two of these packages are sort of related, you're forcing everybody that's using these packages to keep them in sync. So some things to think about. The next things is just what makes a good toolkit. So some of these are just like pro tips and just things that I've run into. And these are pretty universal. They apply to good design systems, toolkits, component line, whatever, just software that other engineers use, I think is how you could sum it up. So the first one goes back to the favoring composition over having too many props. It's really nice, basically having these holes in your code to allow others to have the freedom to inject their own experience and in use cases, allows you to have components that are usable but in many different situations. So with over time, you just have a lot of these tools that are just plug and play. It's like playing with Legos if you do it well enough. So I think that's there's a lot of value and power in having that, especially in a community-driven project, making it so that it's inclusive and every company can pick and choose how they use it, and it's easy for them to fit it into their needs. The next one is lifecycle events. As we talked about before, just making sure that it's easy for others to be able to hook into these parts of it, because just like being able to mix and match UI, allowing companies to mix and match how they interact and what happens as part of the lifecycle of these is very valuable as well. Naming, it's the hardest part of software development, right? Coming up with really good names for props and components themselves, packages, it's all very difficult, but I think there's a lot of value in being able to have an intuitive developer experience, making it so that it's quick for new developers to come in and say, this is what this component does, this is what these props do. I bet there's a prop named this because they can recognize patterns, right? I think recognizing patterns and having those things be consistent is very important. The next one is leveraging the platform. So whatever platform we pick, right? Whether it's just JavaScript or TypeScript, or you go much more opinionated with something like Vue or React, or even more opinionated with like Nux, right? Whatever you pick, I think it's super important to be able to leverage the platform itself and not deviate too much. So if for instance in React has lots of hooks are a big thing. So if you're doing React and you're not using hooks, you're not really leveraging the platform. Or if you go on and do sort of your own type of hook or something, you're not leveraging the platform, and it's something that could be confusing to the end developer. So I think that's a very important one. And the last one is just consistency. If you have 30 of these different packages as part of the toolkit, and each of these components follows different naming structures or has some props the same and some the names are slightly different, or this one has event handlers and it returns this type of data and the other one doesn't, all of those inconsistencies, they might be fine in the scope of that one component, but when you look at it holistically as a toolkit, it really lowers the value from a developer experience aspect, because you then have to go in and try to learn every component. And every time you switch components, you have to go in and relearn the API. So I think that's why across the whole ecosystem of it, you have to be very consistent and come up with these are the things that we want and these are the things that we need. Okay, last star wipe. And that's it, guys. So thank you so much for having me. If you have any questions, hit me up. I'll hang around for a little bit. You can Google me. You can find me on the internet, Joel Saupe. And once again, a plug for Sendoso. So we're hiring. It is a lot of fun work here. So even if you're just remotely interested in finding out what we're all about, please reach out. And yeah, thanks.